A courtroom officer shockingly struck a teenage witness in full view of the assembly, but the entire chamber was taken aback when the boy calmly inquired, "May I speak to my father?" Moments later, a Supreme Court justice entered. He didn't even flinch. That was the most peculiar detail. 17-year-old Quentin Ray stood there in a simple white button-up shirt, arms relaxed at his sides, when Sergeant Nolan Crowell's hand connected with his face. The sharp, brutal sound reverberated off the courtroom walls. A woman in the rear gasped. Someone else murmured, "Did he just?" Nobody moved. Judge Lena Brewster initially remained silent, her mouth agape, but no words emerged. The jurors stared in disbelief. Even the prosecutor, a lean man in a gray suit named Ronald Blaylock, froze, his pen suspended over his notepad. All gazes fixated on Quentin. Not out of concern for him, nor because anyone rushed to his aid, but because he exhibited no reaction. No recoil, no anger, no tears, just a slow, measured inhalation. Quentin looked toward the bench and asked, with unwavering composure, "May I speak to my father?" It was the first complete sentence he had uttered since the assault. The room stayed hushed. Sergeant Crowell, a man built like a fortress with short-cropped blonde hair, offered no apology. He remained near the witness stand, his hand still partially raised, as if uncertain whether his intention was to hit the boy or prevent him from a worse action. The bewilderment on his face wasn't regret. It was a deep-seated fear of having made a grave error. Blaylock finally regained his voice. Your father? Do you require a guardian present, son?" Quentin did not turn to him. He remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the judge. "Justice Aurelian Ray," he stated. That name fundamentally altered everything. The effect was instantaneous. A low murmur erupted in the gallery. One of the jurors recoiled in their seat as if stung. The court clerk nearly dropped her stack of documents. Sergeant Crowell's jaw clenched and his arm slowly lowered to his side. Judge Brewster adjusted her spectacles and leaned back, the gravity of the moment finally settling upon her. "Did you say Justice Aurelian Ray of the United States Supreme Court?" Quentin nodded once, calm, collected, almost unnervingly so. And just like that, the courtroom transformed. People ceased viewing Quentin as merely another youth in a crisp shirt, the kind they might assume was present for truancy or something more severe. Now he possessed a recognized name, one linked to authority, renown, and federal courtrooms in D.C. Suddenly, everyone truly saw him. Yet Quentin did not revel in this shift. He didn't smile, didn't smirk. He stood motionless, same stance, same expression, same unwavering gaze, as if he knew this would never have occurred had they genuinely perceived him from the outset. Sergeant Crowell now retreated, attempting to keep his voice low. "I thought he looked like he was reaching for something." His body language, he raised his hand. "He raised his hand because I sneezed," Quentin stated plainly. "I was covering my mouth." Another wave of silence, and then, as if perfectly choreographed, the courtroom doors swung open. A man entered, a dark charcoal suit, steel-gray hair, deep lines etched into his face that suggested the passage of time rather than stress. He did not hasten, did not speak. He simply walked down the central aisle of the courtroom as if the entire world held its breath. Justice Aurelian Ray. He did not glance left or right, did not scan the gaping faces. His eyes were fixed on his son. And Quentin's expression finally changed, not to fear or even relief, but something closer to serene recognition, the way someone appears when reinforcement arrives, not to fight for them, but to bear witness to what they have already endured. Judge Brewster rose, as did the jury. Even Sergeant Crowell instinctively straightened. But it was too late for posture to rectify what had transpired. Justice Ray did not raise his voice. He had no need to. All he uttered was, "Who laid hands on my son?" But before anyone could answer, the weight of what had just occurred began to settle on everyone in the room, like an unforeseen storm. Quentin wasn't raised to speak unless it truly mattered. Back home in Bloomington, Minnesota, inside a quiet two-story brick house filled with law journals and framed family photographs, Quentin had grown up immersed in structure. Not a cold structure, but more akin to quiet rituals. Neatly folded napkins at dinner, books before bed, and conversations with his father that felt more like strategic chess matches than casual talks. He wasn't a boisterous child, he didn't need to be. His mother, Simone Ray, passed away when he was 8 from breast cancer. It struck the household profoundly, but it never shattered it. Justice Ray instead channeled that grief into something purposeful. He made it a point to be home for dinner every Friday night without exception, even if he'd been on a bench all day in Washington. He'd catch a flight. That table held immense significance. Quentin learned early on that the world didn't always reward politeness, that sometimes, no matter how upright you stood, people still viewed you through a preconceived lens before you even uttered a word. But his father didn't teach him to shout about it. He taught him to outlast it. Every morning before school, Justice Ray would repeat the same advice. You don't have to be loud to be heard. Let the silence say what their noise cannot. Quentin clung to that not out of fear but because he genuinely believed in it. He observed his father dismantle arguments with mere pauses. He witnessed how silence, when expertly wielded, could resonate more powerfully than any tirade. It became his shield. At Lincoln High, Quentin didn't exactly blend in, but he wasn't striving to stand out either. He was one of only a handful of black students in his grade. He joined the debate club, maintained excellent grades, and never encountered issues with teachers. The school counselor often described him as impressively composed, her way of saying he didn't react in the manner she anticipated. But not everyone perceived that calmness as a strength. Some students interpreted it as arrogance. Others saw a challenge as if he believed himself superior, needing to be humbled. There was one particular student, Bo Halderman, a loud, broad-shouldered linebacker with a mouth that moved faster than his mind. He disliked Quentin. Perhaps it was the way Quentin ignored his taunts in the hallway, or the way he corrected teachers without appearing smug. Whatever the reason, it festered. The week prior to the trial, Quentin found himself in the school parking lot after 7th period. He had just concluded a debate meeting and was awaiting his ride when Bo and two of his friends approached. You think you're above us or something? Bo had demanded. Quentin, backpack slung low, simply replied, if you have something to say, just say it. Bo said little else. He shoved Quentin instead, not forcefully enough to knock him down but enough to convey a message. Quentin didn't shove back. He didn't flinch then either. But he did report it. That's why he ended up in court. To provide a statement as a witness in a harassment hearing that Bo's family attempted to keep out of the school board. They insisted on making it a public matter, claiming the school was unfairly targeting Bo, that their son was being misunderstood. So Quentin received a subpoena. He didn't desire drama, didn't want headlines. He simply wanted it to cease. And that's the crucial detail most people missed. They observed a calm, self-assured young man in a courtroom and assumed he could handle whatever came his way. They didn't perceive the accumulation, the months of being viewed askance, the quiet sighs he suppressed, the teachers who told him he was so articulate as if it were a surprise. They didn't see the burden he carried every time he entered a room where people prejudged him before he even spoke his name. But everything they disregarded was about to matter because this time the assault wouldn't be dismissed. This time someone with authority was paying attention. It began over something trivial. A dropped lunch tray, a shoulder bump in the hallway, words exchanged, just enough to capture the assistant principal's notice. But what should have been resolved within the school escalated into something larger, primarily due to who was involved. The school security footage showed Quentin walking away first. He didn't yell, didn't swing, didn't even touch anyone. He simply turned and departed. But Bo Halderman and his group weren't finished. They followed. They wanted a reaction. In the video you can see Bo shove Quentin from behind. Quentin stumbles but regains his balance. He turns, says something too quiet for the microphone to pick up, and then Bo delivers another shove, harder this time. Still, Quentin doesn't retaliate. It wasn't until a teacher on parking lot duty intervened that it stopped. Quentin's shirt collar was stretched, his backpack had been tossed aside. He appeared more embarrassed than anything. Not angry, not frightened, just weary. The school initiated an investigation as was protocol. But Bo's father, Colton Halderman, wouldn't have it. Colton was well known in town, owning 3 hardware stores, running a local men's group and donating to school fundraisers. He had cultivated a reputation as a civic-minded individual. He also wielded influence. So when the school recommended disciplinary action against Bo, suspension and mandatory behavioral counseling, Colton hired a lawyer. He asserted his son was being singled out, that the school was targeting him due to an isolated misunderstanding. He even held a small press conference outside the district office, blaming reverse discrimination and labeling Quentin's account of events overblown. That's how the entire matter ended up in Hennepin County Juvenile Court, not as an expulsion hearing, but as a full-fledged harassment case. And Quentin, he just wanted to be done with it. He never sought to be the emblem of anything, not of fairness, not of racial bias, not of justice. He simply wanted to complete senior year, maintain his GPA, and apply to Brown University as he'd been planning since 10th grade. But instead he was preparing for court. Justice Ray didn't attempt to dissuade him. He sat with Quentin at the kitchen table the night the subpoena arrived. There were no admonishments, just quiet. "I can hire someone," his father had offered. "You don't have to speak if you're not ready." "I want to speak," Quentin replied. His father studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then speak carefully." The night before the hearing, Quentin ironed his shirt 3 times. Not because it was wrinkled, it wasn't, but because he knew people would scrutinize every detail. If there was a scuff on his shoe, it would convey something about him. If he slouched in his chair, someone would say he looked indifferent. If he appeared too confident, it would be arrogance. Too nervous, guilt. He wasn't on trial, but in some respects he was. On the morning of the hearing, he sat quietly in the lobby outside courtroom 3B. His name wasn't listed on the docket as a defendant, yet a clerk called it out as if it were. When Quentin stood, people observed. Even the way he entered the room caused some to lean back in their chairs, as if anticipating something. Sergeant Crowell was already inside. He stood near the courtroom entrance, arms folded, surveying the room the way officers do when assessing who looks suspicious. When Quentin walked past him, he said nothing, simply gave him a lingering once-over. And that's where the tension began, not with words but with gazes, with body language, with assumptions. The hearing itself was supposed to be routine. Quentin would give his testimony, the lawyers would file their motions, the judge would make a recommendation. It should have been procedural. But it never reached that point, because Crowell's suspicion had already begun to simmer before Quentin ever took the stand. But no one anticipated that suspicion to erupt into something physical, not in front of a judge, not inside a courtroom, and certainly not toward a witness who hadn't even finished speaking. The courtroom in Hennepin County Courthouse was unremarkable. Pale wood padded chairs, a clock that ticked too loudly in silence. But that morning, it felt as if pressure permeated the walls. The kind of pressure that compels you to sit straighter without realizing why. Quentin sat in the witness box, legs still, hands loosely folded. He had been called up more quickly than expected. The prosecutor, Ronald Blaylock, gave him a small nod as he approached but said little else. No warm-up, no gentle introduction. "State your name for the record." "Quentin Ray." "Your age?" 17. "And you're currently enrolled at Lincoln High School?" "Yes." Blaylock cleared his throat. "Can you describe what happened after school on the afternoon of April 3rd? Quentin paused before responding, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he'd been taught to allow people time to listen. "I was in the parking lot. I had just left debate. I was waiting for my dad to pick me up. And then I was approached by Bo Halderman and 2 other students. He pushed me twice. I didn't respond physically. I told a staff member and it was reported." Blaylock nodded. "Were you injured?" "No." "Did you provoke Mr. Halderman in any way?" "No." "Did you make any threats, verbal or otherwise?" "No." As Quentin answered, his voice did not waver. He didn't rush. Every word landed evenly, precisely as he'd practiced. But as he spoke, you could feel a shift in the room. It wasn't about what he was saying, it was how. Calm. Too calm. Some people probably thought he didn't sound like a frightened child. He sounded certain. Some individuals do not appreciate that. Sergeant Crowell stood against the far wall, observing, not just listening but watching. He wasn't even attempting to conceal it. Arms crossed, eyes narrowed, head tilted slightly as if awaiting Quentin to falter. Judge Brewster noticed too. She glanced at Crowell more than once but remained silent. The defense attorney, Howard Sedgwick, leaned forward at his table. He resembled someone's dentist, neat hair, heavy tie, hands folded just a little too tightly. When it was his turn, he approached slowly, holding his yellow legal pad as if it contained secrets. "Quentin," he said with a polite tone that was too polished to trust, "you said you didn't respond physically, correct?" "Correct." "Not even a raised arm?" "A defensive gesture." I lifted my hands when he got close to keep space between us. That's all. And how would someone, say a bystander, interpret that motion? Could it be seen as aggressive? Not unless they were looking for it to be. A few people in the courtroom shifted at that. Sedgwick paused, scribbled something down, then looked back up. You have no history of aggression at school? No fights? No written referrals? None. And you believe the school took the appropriate steps? I believe the school did what it could. But that's why we're here now. It was a clean exchange, too clean, as if Sedgwick was trying to incite something that wasn't present. When he conceded and stepped back, he gave Sergeant Krell a glance. It lasted only a second, but Quentin caught it. Then it happened. Judge Brewster requested a 5-minute recess before the next witness. Quentin stepped down from the box, walked toward the side of the courtroom where he'd been instructed to sit. But as he passed Krell, the officer mumbled something under his breath. Quentin stopped, turned slightly. What did you say? Krell didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward and stated, loud enough for the room to hear, "Keep your hands to yourself next time." I wasn't. Quentin began, but before he could finish, Krell raised his hand and struck him. The sound resonated through the room like something shattering. But it wasn't the impact that made the room cease breathing. It was Quentin's face, still composed, almost weary, and the fact that he didn't move a muscle. Time didn't slow down. It simply stopped functioning correctly. The instant Sergeant Nolan Krell's hand made contact with Quentin's cheek, everything inside that courtroom fractured. People didn't gasp immediately. They didn't even speak. It was as if the entire room had forgotten how to react. Quentin's head tilted slightly with the impact, but his feet didn't stir, his shoulders didn't twitch. He stood the same way he did when Bo shoved him behind the gym, grounded, centered, awaiting someone else to determine what they would make of him. Judge Brewster pushed herself up from her chair so rapidly that the wheels shrieked against the platform. Sergeant Krell. Her voice emerged sharp, almost startled, as if she couldn't believe what her own eyes had witnessed. What the hell do you think you're doing? Krell didn't answer, not immediately. His eyes were locked on Quentin, who had slowly turned his head back to face forward. I told him to keep his hands down, Krell stated, but even as he spoke, his voice sounded uncertain, as if he had already realized the extent of his miscalculation. Blaylock dropped his pen. Sedgwick stood frozen, looking as though the floor had just been pulled out from under him. The bailiff near the door took a step forward, unsure whether to intervene or await orders. Quentin didn't look around. He didn't touch his face. He didn't cry. He simply repeated, but louder this time, "May I speak to my father?" This time the ensuing silence struck harder. There was a kind of collective understanding that swept through the courtroom, like the calm before a thunderclap. People were whispering now, confused, anxious, attempting to comprehend what had just transpired. Judge Brewster blinked, adjusting her glasses as if they were the problem. "Your father is present? He'll be here in a minute. Quentin said he asked me to text him if something happened." Before anyone could respond, a phone buzzed at the clerk's desk. Then the courtroom doors opened and everything shifted. Justice Aurelian Ray entered the room as if he had already been briefed by every wall and corner within it. He didn't walk quickly, didn't speak, didn't look at anyone but his son. Quentin didn't smile, didn't move, just returned that same steady, quiet connection the two had always shared. Justice Ray approached the bench. He didn't ask for permission, didn't seek protocol. He spoke directly to the judge, his voice cool and grounded. "I was informed there was an incident." Judge Brewster appeared flustered. "Justice Ray, this isn't procedure. Procedure was broken the moment a court officer assaulted my son during testimony." Krell flinched, not visibly but internally something was crumbling. Justice Ray turned to face him now, slowly, as if prolonging each second was an act of mercy. "You touched him." Krell opened his mouth but no words came out. "I thought he was... his hands." "You thought?" Justice Ray repeated, his voice cutting. "That's the problem. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. Didn't need to be. It was the kind of statement that fills a courtroom more than shouting ever could. You saw a calm, unarmed teenager and decided he was a threat? In a courthouse? Under supervision? With a judge present." Krell's hands had begun to tremble, ever so slightly, but everyone noticed. Quentin sat down again, not because he was told to, but because he had already conveyed what he needed to. The rest was now in the room with his father. You didn't restrain him, Justice Ray continued. You didn't warn him. You struck him. He turned to Judge Brewster. This is not about my position. This is about precedent. If this officer can assault a witness in front of the bench and walk away with a badge intact, then we're not protecting anyone. We're just performing justice for show. And with that, Justice Ray stepped back, folded his hands and waited. But no one in the courtroom wanted to be the first to speak because anything said after that had to carry weight. No one articulated it, but the authority in the room had shifted. Judge Brewster was still seated on the bench, technically presiding, but all eyes were on Justice Aurelian Ray, not because of his title, but because of the way the atmosphere seemed to bend around him as if the law itself had entered, wearing a familiar but rarely seen face. Judge Brewster cleared her throat and leaned forward slightly. Justice Ray, I understand your presence here complicates things procedurally. However, I assure you we will handle this through the proper channels. Justice Ray didn't challenge her. He nodded once. My concern, he said calmly, is not just about my son. It's about the message this courtroom has now sent, not just to him, but to every young person who walks into a space like this hoping to be protected by it. Brewster opened her mouth to respond. But Justice Ray wasn't finished. I've served on panels reviewing police conduct. I've ruled on Fourth Amendment cases. I've written opinions on qualified immunity and courtroom procedure. And I've spent the last 20 years watching the slow erosion of public trust in the very systems I was sworn to uphold. He glanced at Sergeant Krell, who now stood stiffly, eyes downcast. So tell me, Ray continued, his voice still even, how do you suggest we rebuild that trust when a court officer feels emboldened to strike a witness mid-testimony in public view and assumes there'll be no consequence? Judge Brewster leaned back, visibly uncomfortable. I assure you there will be consequence. Assurance is no longer sufficient, Ray replied, his tone never rising but his words growing heavier. Visibility is required. Accountability must be documented. He looked over at Quentin now, whose face had not changed. He looked as he had all morning, patient, unreadable. Krell finally attempted to speak. I made a mistake. I accept responsibility. Justice Ray tilted his head. What mistake? Be specific. Krell shifted. I read the boy's body language wrong. I thought he was being disrespectful because he raised a hand to sneeze. Yes. And that warranted physical contact. Krell didn't answer. Judge Brewster finally spoke up. Sergeant Krell, you are relieved of courtroom duty effective immediately. You will surrender your badge until an internal review is conducted by courthouse administration and the sheriff's office. A quiet murmur of approval rippled through the room. But Justice Ray wasn't quite done. He turned back to the judge. With respect, the review cannot be internal only. I'll be requesting an independent investigator through the Department of Justice. Judge Brewster nodded slowly. Understood. Only then did Justice Ray take a step back. He looked over at his son again, and this time Quentin's expression changed just slightly, a soft breath, a kind of release, not of tension but of restraint. The room didn't notice, but his father did. Sedgwick, still standing off to the side, stepped forward awkwardly. Your Honor, do we continue? That question hung in the air. Quentin stood. I'm willing to finish my testimony. Judge Brewster nodded, impressed but trying not to show it. Very well, Mr. Ray. Please return to the stand. Quentin walked back to the witness chair and sat down again. This time no one interrupted. No sideways glances, no muttering under breath. Just open ears and still hands. Blaylock, the prosecutor, cleared his throat. Quentin, would you like a moment? No, sir. Then if you're ready, you were describing the moment Beau Halderman made physical contact with you in the parking lot. Quentin nodded. He shoved me. I didn't shove back. He tried again. I stepped away. That's all. Blaylock leaned into the pause. Why didn't you react physically? Quentin looked out over the room before answering. Because I knew it wouldn't be seen the same way. There was nothing left to say after that. But deep down, everyone knew the real trial had already occurred, and not a single word of it was recorded in the official transcript. The remainder of the hearing proceeded slowly, not because the case was intricate, it wasn't, but because the room had fundamentally shifted. Every question, every answer, every objection felt heavier, as if being weighed in a completely different court. Quentin answered what was necessary. The facts were unambiguous. Beau Halderman had approached him, shoved him twice. The school confirmed the footage. 3 teachers submitted statements corroborating Quentin's account. Even the defense ceased pressing after a while, their argument dissipating like smoke. But no one was paying much attention to Beau anymore, not truly. All eyes kept drifting back to Sergeant Krell, who now sat alone on the side bench, shoulders hunched, the luster of authority gone from his uniform. After the closing statements, Judge Brewster announced a short recess before delivering her recommendations. People filtered into the hallway, speaking in hushed tones, pretending to scroll their phones but truly observing the Ray family, watching Justice Ray stand beside his son like a silent caution. Quentin sat on a bench near the vending machines. His father stood across from him, hands behind his back. Neither spoke for a while. Then Quentin broke the silence. "Do you think they'll do anything real?" Justice Ray looked over. "They're already doing something real. They're listening. That's not the same as acting. It never is. But listening is where it starts. Always has been." Quentin didn't respond. He didn't require a pep talk. What he desired was more difficult. Clarity, a reason. Justice Ray sat beside him slowly. "You asked me once why I never lose my temper in the courtroom." Quentin looked over. "Yeah, I remember. I told you anger makes things louder, but silence makes things clear." Justice Ray let that thought settle for a moment. "But I wasn't always calm," he added. "When I was your age, I wanted to demolish every wall that stood in front of me. But I realized they're built to withstand rage. They're not built to withstand truth, spoken clearly, steadily over time. That's what erodes them." Quentin nodded, not in agreement but to show he was internalizing it. The bailiff reappeared. "Judge Brewster's ready." Back in the courtroom, Judge Brewster took her seat and began reading her findings into the record. She ruled that Beau Halderman's actions constituted targeted harassment and recommended his immediate suspension, plus behavioral intervention. It wasn't jail time, but it would remain on his record. It was something. Then she turned to Sergeant Krell. "This court has already taken preliminary action by relieving Sergeant Krell of courtroom duties. But given the nature of this incident and the visibility of the parties involved, I am formally requesting an external investigation through the Department of Justice, as well as a public review of all prior courtroom incidents involving this officer." There was a soft murmur from the back of the room. Krell didn't dispute. He didn't move, just sat there like a statue someone no longer held in admiration. After court adjourned, the press had already gathered outside. Reporters, microphones, flashing lights. They weren't there when the day began. They arrived later, after the impact, after the revelation, after the shift. Justice Ray kept his son close. Quentin looked tired but not shaken. One reporter pushed forward. "Justice Ray, any comment on what happened inside today?" Justice Ray paused for a second, then replied, "I came to see my son testify. I left with a reminder." "A reminder of what?" the reporter inquired. "That civility doesn't begin with a uniform. It begins with discipline. And that respect must not only be expected, it must be shown." Quentin looked at the cameras but did not speak. He didn't have to. But in that silence something resonated, not in the air but in the people who watched. Because this time they couldn't avert their gaze. In the days that followed, clips from the courtroom went viral. Not just the physical contact, though that moment was shared more times than anyone could count, but the still frame immediately afterward. The image of Quentin unmoved, looking forward while Krell's hand was still in midair. It was ubiquitous. Some headlines focused on outrage. Others leaned into curiosity. "Son of Supreme Court Justice assaulted in courtroom," one read. "Officer suspended after striking teen witness," another stated. But the ones that persisted longest were simpler. "He didn't flinch." Back in Bloomington, things didn't return to precisely normal, but they stabilized. Quentin's teachers gave him space. Some classmates viewed him differently, as if unsure how to interact with him anymore. A few apologized, even if they hadn't directly done anything wrong. Others avoided him entirely, perhaps fearing they were part of what had gone awry, even in silence. Beau Halderman's family didn't say much after the judge's decision. They kept things quiet. The lawyer vanished from the public eye. Colton Halderman removed his campaign posters for the school board. But something more significant occurred outside of the headlines. Students began asking questions. In classrooms, in the cafeteria, and after-school meetings. Kids who had never discussed fairness or power, or what truly felt safe started talking. Teachers noticed it. Parents did too. And Quentin? He remained grounded. One night, 2 weeks after the hearing, he sat across from his father at the kitchen table again. No cameras, no audience, just the familiar tick of the old wall clock and the sound of plates being cleared. "Do you regret going through with it?" his father asked. Quentin shook his head. "No. Just tired." Justice Ray sipped from his glass. "Tired is part of it. But tired isn't the end. I just hate that it took that for people to hear me." His father looked up. "And now that they have?" Quentin thought for a second. "Now I know how much they weren't listening before." Justice Ray didn't argue. He didn't try to soften the truth. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin folder. Inside was a letter from the U.S. Marshals Service. A formal review of Sergeant Krell's conduct had been initiated, not just concerning that day but his history. Other complaints were now being examined. Some had never even been looked at before. "They're watching now," Justice Ray said. Quentin didn't smile, but there was a small nod, the kind of nod exchanged between two people who know the journey is long, but they are still traversing it. At school, the administration scheduled training for court officers and faculty, not merely for procedures but for bias, language, presence. Small advances, but they were steps, not just because of a courtroom scandal but because of what it revealed and who revealed it. People began to comprehend that what happened to Quentin wasn't uncommon. What was rare was who his father was, and that's what made it impossible to overlook. The lesson wasn't solely about race or uniforms or courtrooms. It was about perception, about how some children must prove they aren't dangerous before anyone listens to what they are actually saying. It was about silence, the kind that is misunderstood, the kind that is penalized, and also the kind that carries immense power when used with intention. Quentin didn't grant interviews. He didn't join campaigns. He didn't write op-eds. He returned to school, maintained his grades, applied to Brown as planned. But people remembered him not for what he said but for what he didn't do. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't retaliate. He didn't crumble. And that quiet resilience, that composure in the face of humiliation, left something more profound in the minds of those who witnessed it than any speech ever could. But the story doesn't conclude there, because stories like this don't truly end. They echo, they linger. In the way people sit up straighter when a quiet child raises his hand. In the way a badge is worn with more circumspection. In the way one boy, for just a moment, reminded a courtroom what justice is meant to feel like. Sometimes the most impactful moment in a narrative is the pause that follows it. Quentin didn't intend to make a statement. He didn't enter that courtroom seeking a headline. He came to speak the truth and ended up demonstrating to everyone in that room what silence, restraint, and dignity truly look like under duress. The officer who struck him didn't just cross a boundary. He exposed one, the thin, fragile line between how people claim justice operates and how it actually unfolds when no one is observing. Only this time someone was watching, and this time they had a voice people couldn't disregard. What made this moment significant wasn't that Quentin's father was a Supreme Court justice. It wasn't even that the courtroom was filled with people who gasped when his name was spoken. It was the way Quentin conducted himself. Not just when he was hit, but afterward, when everyone anticipated anger or outrage, he offered them something stronger: stillness. That kind of strength doesn't originate from privilege. It doesn't come from power. It comes from knowing precisely who you are when someone attempts to strip that from you. And it reminds the rest of us how effortlessly perception distorts reality, and how often individuals like Quentin walk into rooms already burdened by a weight they did not request. We speak extensively about justice. But what this story illustrates is that justice isn't merely dispensed from behind a bench or handed down in rulings. Sometimes, justice stems from being seen, truly seen, without assumptions, without bias, without someone flinching simply because you raised your hand to sneeze. There are so many Quentins out there. Quiet children, focused children, children who do everything correctly and still are treated like threats, not because they misbehave but because they are not believed. And that's the core point. It's not enough to punish people after they inflict harm. The real work lies in unlearning the reflex that caused it in the first place. It's in altering who receives the benefit of the doubt. It's in questioning why someone like Krell believed a teenager like Quentin was dangerous, not once, not in a fleeting moment of poor judgment, but in a setting designed to safeguard the innocent. Because a courtroom is supposed to be a sanctuary of fairness, but fairness must reside in the people who work there, not just in the wood and rules surrounding them. And if a judge like Aurelian Ray hadn't walked through those doors, would the world have cared? Would the incident have simply become another misunderstanding, buried under procedure? Quentin didn't retaliate. He didn't yell. He stood still and allowed the world to witness what occurred when someone who should never have been touched was struck simply due to how he was perceived. That image is still circulating, still being shared, still being debated. But perhaps, just perhaps, it's also being learned from. So the next time someone tells you silence equates to weakness, or that calm means you're letting something slide, remember Quentin. Remember the boy who remained still while the room ignited, and waited for the truth to speak louder than any physical strike. If this story made you ponder, if it evoked any feeling at all, take a moment to share it. Not just for views, not just for clicks, but because someone else might need to hear it. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit subscribe, because the more light we shed on narratives that reflect real experience, the harder it becomes for silence to be mistaken for invisibility.